Wits governance expert Professor Alex van den Heever joins us now to weigh in on the new cabinet that is expected to be announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa in the upcoming days. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Always great having you with us. So we've already seen media squabbles about who has what powers and who didn't read or understand the current agreement, making media headlines this past week. Is this supposed to inspire any confidence, particularly on the voters, that this GNU actually does have a policy framework, Prof?
Well, it doesn't have a policy framework at this point, but it is meant to be showing that it is a government of unity, and that means that there's an agreement framework that underpins it, and it's going to be important that the various participants in the agreement actually function in accordance with that agreement and don't abuse it. So I think that part of the teething problems will be whether or not people are questioning the conduct of different groupings in adhering to the agreement. So this is, I think, where the problem arises at this point. I think it's teething problems, but I do think that all the parties do need to think of the country first and not their own special interests.
Prof, so what would you suggest then is the needed or required leadership or directive that is required to make this GNU work for all the parties that are involved, as well as their constituencies, which is, of course, the electorate?
So one of the things that was done in 93 and 94 was to make sure that where difficulties arise, and that was a big transition in South Africa's history, and that there were going to be tricky issues that arise, acts of violence, attempts to destabilize the whole process, existing vested interests that need to be dealt with. And what they had was a bridging arrangement, a way of dealing with these things directly before they entered into the public domain. I don't see that working at the moment, but in essence what's required here is that the conversations around the agreement need to be between adults around the agreement, and basically stresses and problems need to be talked out before they end up in the public domain. So I think that the things that we're hearing at the moment, we don't need to hear about. They need to be addressed between the different groupings themselves, because they're not the big policy issues. But basically the agreement as agreed to does need to be adhered to, and we don't need people to go to court to enforce this agreement at the end of the day. It can't be done. This is about trust. It's about being bigger than one's individual party, and essentially you do need to have a mechanism by which areas of disagreement are dealt with between the parties and not in the public.
Absolutely, Professor, because then one has to wonder, I mean, if the parties are already disagreeing about some of these decisions or their agreements, gentlemen agreements, if we can call it that at this particular stage, one wonders what's going to happen when bigger decisions, as you've referred to, that pertain to issues like service delivery need to be at the core. So now the issue of involving voters and, of course, making this as transparent as possible a process. Shouldn't this be the way to go, Professor, particularly after the fact that there's no party that won outright majority? A lot of speculation is around the fact that some parties are only joining the GNU to further their election campaign, their campaign policies, of which we all know did not garner enough support to be elected outright as outright winners.
Yeah, so this is the problem, is whether or not the government of national unity is going to be gamed by the incumbent party, the ANC, attempting to avoid actual accountability for having lost a lot of electoral support. The reality is that parties are meant to work together at this stage. And that basically it now has to be understood and sort of operationalized. But in essence, this is an inevitable risk, that there are going to be difficulties, there are going to be people who are going to try and hang on to power, there are going to be people who are trying to get what they can out of this agreement. This is inevitable. The question now is, do we have people who are big enough and have a focus on the long term, are they going to be big enough to be able to decide on mechanisms to deal with these disagreements? They're inevitable, they're expected, they're going to happen. They're going to happen every month, every week, and basically this is a process that's going to continue for the next 5 years. I think it can definitely hang together if these mechanisms are understood and agreed to. But the question of whether or not little parties who really have very little to offer in terms of overall governance should be in the government of national unity is a question that the voters are at the end of the day going to have to look at the end of the day, whether these are just patronage appointments to kind of dilute the government of national unity and not actually about governing this country better. Because I've not seen great talent in some of the smaller parties that would be coming in, but I think that the issue is now we do need talent in the executive government. We need to have people who can actually run this country. We can't have people who are just big mouths.
Absolutely, Professor. You know, the market seemingly, as well as, the international community is seemingly happy about this proposed idea of national government of unity. But it seems like the train is not taking off as we should expect on the ground, as you've alluded to. So how long then do you think it will take for all these parties to actually come to a civil understanding and come to understand that nobody's actually holding the torch here, except it's a combined effort by all those parties that form the GNU to work for South Africans?
Yes, so I think so. Firstly, the reaction of the markets is important because it actually it shows that there is real potential in a genuine government of national unity that's not manipulated. And that's going to be very important. And if we get it right, there are huge potential gains for South Africa. The danger, I think, that exists is that there's been considerable corruption and patronage in the ANC and government to the state that's recognized by the ANC, and it's one of the reasons why they've lost a lot of votes. We have to have a government that doesn't allow that to continue, and there are going to be tensions both within the ANC and in relation to other parties who seek to protect that corruption. So this is probably more important than specific policy issues. There's a risk for some people if we have a functioning government of national unity, and they're going to try very hard to disrupt this government of national unity. So it's really, really important that there is a predominant effort to keep the overall approach in place and for it to be genuine. And for that to work, basically mechanisms are needed in place, trust needs to be built, there needs to be a focus on good leadership and the appointment of people who can do the job. I haven't been encouraged by some of the appointments and the processes in the provinces that have that the ANC have won fully. They really seem like they're just continuing with business as usual. We can't afford that at the national level, and we can't afford that in provinces like Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Unfortunately, a province like the Eastern Cape might continue to fail and deindustrialize badly as a consequence of poor governance, but we can't afford that to be a national issue. So yeah, this government of national unity does have to work. It's recognized by the markets that it can work, but there is a risk that it will basically be gamed and it won't reach its full potential.
Prof, you touched on something very critical that I was actually going to make reference to, the fact that there's already criticisms around some appointments in those provincial legislatures. Thank you so much for that input, as always. Of course, Professor Alex van der Heever, Wits School of Governance, there also weighing in on the GNU.